The first time Julia Merritt saw Monroe Sheridan ride into Caldwell, Kansas, she dropped the entire basket of clean laundry she had been carrying, and not a single soul in town blamed her for it. It was the spring of 1879, and Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a bead of sweat on a man's brow, equal parts rough and promising. The cattle drives had been pushing through for years, and the town had grown accordingly, sprouting saloons and dry goods stores and a proper telegraph office alongside the older, rougher establishments that catered to drovers who had been on the trail for months and had money burning through their pockets like fire through dry grass. Julia had lived in Caldwell her whole 23 years of life, and she had seen every manner of cowboy, gambler, and drifter pass through. She had learned early on to keep her eyes level and her expression neutral, the way a woman learned to do when she had been plain her whole life and knew that no one was coming to sweep her off her feet. She was plain. She knew it the way she knew the color of the sky or the smell of coming rain. She was not ugly. She had always reasoned with herself during the quiet moments before sleep when a woman's thoughts turned honest. She was simply unremarkable. Her hair was a dark brown that refused to hold curls no matter how many rags she slept in, always falling straight and a little flat against her shoulders. Her eyes were a gray that some people called interesting and others simply overlooked. Her nose was slightly too long for the rest of her face, and her mouth was wide in a way that did not suit the fashionable pursed expression she saw in the Harper's Bazaar copies that came through the dry goods store. She was slender from hard work and not particularly tall, and she had the rough hands of a woman who took in laundry for a living and kept a garden, and did not have the luxury of worrying too much about the state of her complexion. She was fine. She had told herself that for years. Fine was enough. Fine got through the day. But Monroe Sheridan rode into Caldwell on a big sorrel gelding with the afternoon sun at his back, and Julia Merritt's definition of fine collapsed entirely. He was tall even in the saddle, broad across the shoulders in the way that came from real work and not just good fortune. His hat was battered and dark, pulled low against the Kansas wind, and he had the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who took their time with the work. He was not precisely handsome in the way that saloon paintings depicted men, all smooth and symmetrical. He was something better than handsome. He was solid and real and alive in a way that made the air around him feel different, as though the whole street recognized that something significant had arrived. He rode easy, the way men who had spent years in the saddle rode, like the horse beneath him, was simply an extension of his own body, and he had a bedroll and saddlebags that spoke of a man who had come a long distance and was not in a particular hurry to explain himself. He glanced down the main street of Caldwell with those dark eyes of his, taking the measure of the town, and his gaze passed over Julia standing there at the edge of the boardwalk with her wicker basket and her scattered clean sheets, and he touched the brim of his hat to her, brief and courteous, before riding on toward the livery stable. She stood there for a full 30 seconds before she remembered the laundry. He was 28 years old, she would learn later. He had ridden trail from Texas twice before, had spent time in Abilene and Wichita when those towns were still the end of the line for the cattle drives, and had come to Caldwell because the work was here now, and because a man needed work the way he needed water. His name was Monroe Sheridan, and he had taken a position as a hired hand at the Dobbins Ranch just north of town, which was one of the larger operations in the county, and employed a crew of 8 men through the busy season. He had arrived with strong references from a rancher down in Denton County, Texas, a reputation for being reliable and even-tempered, and a quality that the rancher in Denton had described simply as good sense, which was rarer than it sounded in the territory. Julia knew all of this because she took laundry from the Dobbins Ranch. She had done so for 3 years, ever since her mother had passed and left her the small house on the edge of town and the practical problem of supporting herself within it. The Dobbins operation paid well and paid on time, which was more than she could say for some of her other clients, and so every 10 days she walked the 2 miles out to the ranch, collected the linens and the work shirts, walked them back, washed and pressed everything with the iron she heated on her wood stove, and returned them. It was an honest living. It kept her comfortable enough. It kept her from having to ask anyone for anything. It was on her second trip out to the Dobbins ranch, after Monroe Sheridan's arrival, that she first spoke to him properly. She had come in the early morning, while the dew was still on the grass and the air had the particular clarity that it only possessed before the heat came down like a hand pressing the whole territory flat. The ranch hands were already at their work, mending fence along the north pasture, and she had walked around the side of the main house to where Mrs. Dobbins' housekeeper, an older Mexican woman named Esperanza, always left the collection of laundry waiting in a wooden crate. She was wrestling with the crate, which was heavier than usual because it had been 2 weeks instead of 10 days and had accumulated accordingly, when she heard boots on the dirt behind her. "Let me help you with that." She straightened and turned, and there he was, Monroe Sheridan, standing 3 feet away with his hat in his hand because he had apparently just come from speaking with someone in the house and had not yet put it back on. Without the hat he looked younger, though not by much, and his dark hair was pressed flat on top from where the hat had sat and curled slightly at the ends. He was watching her with the kind of direct attention that made her immediately aware of the straight-down flatness of her own hair and the state of her work dress, and the fact that she had not had occasion to think about any of these things before this precise moment. "I have it," she said, which was not entirely true. "I can see you have it," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it, warm and unhurried. "I am offering to help regardless." She considered arguing further and then decided against it on the basis that arguing would require her to keep looking at him, and she was not at all sure she could do that for extended periods without making a fool of herself. "All right," she said. He put his hat back on, lifted the crate as though it weighed nothing, and said, "Where are you headed?" "Back to town. I take in laundry." She said it directly, the way she always did, not apologetically but not with any particular pride either. It was simply what she did. He nodded as though this was entirely reasonable information and fell into step beside her on the dirt road back toward town. "I'm Monroe Sheridan," he said. "Just hired on here 3 weeks back." "I know," she said, and then felt the color come up in her face because that sounded like she had been paying attention to him specifically, which she absolutely had but did not intend to advertise. "Mrs. Dobbins mentioned it," she added, which was not precisely a lie since Esperanza had mentioned it and Esperanza worked for Mrs. Dobbins. "And you are?" "Julia Merritt." "Miss Merritt," he said, and the way he said it was not particularly remarkable except that it was. He said it like it was worth saying carefully. He carried the crate all the way to town, walking alongside her and talking about the ranch and the spring roundup that was coming and asking her questions about Caldwell, about how long she had lived there and what it had been like when she was a child. He was easy to talk to in the way that genuinely interested people were easy to talk to, because he asked questions and then actually listened to the answers, and he did not look at her the way men usually did, which was either with the dismissive glance that moved through her and landed somewhere else, or with the calculating look of a man who thought a woman living alone was necessarily available for whatever he had in mind. He looked at her like she was a person he had encountered and was finding interesting. It was so unfamiliar that she barely knew what to do with it. He set the crate down at her door and touched his hat, and she said thank you, and he said it was no trouble, and he walked away back toward the ranch. She stood in her doorway and watched him go, and then told herself firmly that was quite enough of that. It was not, in fact, quite enough of that. He came to town on Saturday evenings with some of the other ranch hands, and Caldwell on a Saturday evening was lively enough that avoiding anyone was difficult. She ran into him at the general store where she had gone for lye and a spool of thread, and he was purchasing tobacco and a new leather punch, and he tipped his hat to her, and she nodded back, and that was the whole of it, but her heart behaved unreasonably for the rest of the evening. She was not the kind of woman who daydreamed. She had always considered it a waste of time that could be better spent doing something practical. But she found herself, in the evenings when the laundry was done and the fire was banked down, and there was nothing left to occupy her hands, thinking about him. About the way he had carried that heavy crate like it was nothing and talked to her like she was worth talking to. She put a firm stop to it every time, the same way she might put a firm stop to a door blowing open in the wind. She was practical. She knew what she was and what she was not. Monroe Sheridan was the kind of man who could have his pick. He was capable and decent, and had that quality of presence that made rooms feel different when he entered them. Women noticed him in Caldwell the same way she had noticed him on that first day. And some of those women were beautiful in the way that novels described beauty, soft-skinned and bright-eyed, and fashionably dressed. There was the sheriff's daughter, Caroline Pierce, who was 20 and had golden hair and a laugh that carried across the street and made men turn their heads. There was the schoolteacher, a woman named Ada Walsh, who had come from St. Louis and carried herself with a quiet elegance that made Julia acutely aware of her own rough hands and serviceable clothes every time she saw her. Julia Merritt took in laundry. She had gray eyes and straight brown hair and wide mouth and a nose that did not photograph well, not that she had ever had occasion to be photographed. She was sensible about these things. She was always sensible. The trouble was that Monroe Sheridan did not seem to consult her sensibility before doing things that made it very difficult to maintain. It was the first week of May when he appeared at her door on a Tuesday morning with his hat in both hands and a request. One of the other ranch hands, a young man named Petey Greer, had been thrown from a horse and broken his wrist, and was laid up at the boarding house in town, and Monroe was collecting Petey's laundry to bring to her since Petey had been bringing it himself before the accident. He stood at her door and explained all of this with a thoroughness that suggested he was slightly nervous, which she found immediately disarming because it had not occurred to her that he was capable of being nervous. "That's fine," she said. "Tell Petey I hope he heals quickly. A broken wrist is unpleasant business." "He is complaining about it extensively," Monroe said, and that warmth in his voice was there again. "He has been telling everyone who will listen about how much it hurts, and some who would prefer not to listen." She laughed before she could stop herself, and it came out genuine and a little unguarded, and she saw something shift in his expression when she laughed, something that settled and brightened at the same time. She brought herself back to her usual composure quickly, but it was too late. The laugh was already out there. "I also wanted to ask," he said, turning his hat by the brim in his hands, "whether you might be willing to attend the dance at the Grange Hall on Friday, with me, if you are not otherwise engaged." The silence that followed was probably not as long as it felt to her, but it felt very long indeed. She looked at him standing there in the morning light, big and dark-eyed and earnest, with his hat turning in his capable hands. She looked at the way the morning light caught the angles of his face and the genuine hope in his expression. And then she looked down at her own hands, wrapped around the doorframe, the knuckles roughened from the washboard and the skin stained faintly at the edges from the lye she used on Mondays. "Mr. Sheridan," she said carefully, "that is a very kind offer." "It is not kindness," he said. "It is that I would very much like to take you to the dance and spend the evening talking to you and perhaps dancing if you are willing, and I thought asking directly was the most honest approach." She felt something warm and treacherous move through her chest. She tamped it down with both hands, metaphorically speaking. "You are a kind man," she said again, because she meant it, and because it was important that she was clear about this, "but I think you have perhaps not considered the matter fully." "I have considered it considerably," he said. "I take in laundry," she said. "I am not—" She stopped and started again. "There are other women in this town who would suit you better. Younger women, more attractive women, women more appropriate for a man in your position." Something changed in his face. Not offense, not exactly, but a kind of sharpening of attention. What position would that be? You know what I mean, she said. You are the sort of man that women notice. I am not the sort of woman that men notice, and I have made my peace with that, truly I have, but it means I know the difference. I am not pretty enough for a man like you, and I think if you considered the matter honestly you would see that. He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of a man groping for a polite response. The silence of a man who was taking something seriously and deciding how to answer it with the weight it deserved. Let me decide that, he said. 3 words, said quietly and without drama, and they went through her like sunlight through glass. Mr. Sheridan Monroe, he said, and I mean what I say. You do not get to tell me what I find or do not find attractive, Miss Merritt. That decision belongs to me. And what I find, when I look at you, is a woman who is interesting and honest and alive in a way that a great many beautiful women I have met have not managed to be. I find a woman who laughs like she means it, and who carries her own weight and looks people in the eye. I am asking you to the dance because I want to be in the same room as you and see whether the rest of the evening feels as good as every other time I have managed to be in the same place as you. He stopped. So let me decide, please. She held onto the doorframe for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Friday, she said finally. Friday, he confirmed. He put his hat back on and touched the brim. 7 o'clock, I will come to your door. He left, and she stood there in the morning air and told herself for the last time that she was going to be sensible about this. And then she went inside and stood at her washboard and smiled at nothing for the rest of the morning. She spent the better part of the next 2 days in a state of quiet agitation that manifested as extremely thorough laundry work and the rearrangement of everything in her kitchen that did not strictly need to be rearranged. She had 2 presentable dresses. One was the dark blue calico she wore on Sundays to church, which was plain but clean and fit her well. The other was a green dress that had belonged to her mother, let out at the seams and taken in at the waist over the years, made of a slightly better fabric than anything Julia had purchased for herself, with a modest collar and buttons that were still good. She wore the green dress. She pressed it the night before with the flat iron until it lay perfectly smooth, and she pressed the dark blue as well so she would have options. On Friday evening, she did her hair up properly, which meant the straight brown mass of it was pinned with some care, and a few pieces left loose around her face in the way she had seen other women wear theirs. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand and told herself the truth. She looked like herself, which was to say not beautiful but presentable and neat and perhaps not entirely unpleasant. It would have to be enough. It was what she had to offer. Monroe arrived at 7 o'clock exactly, which told her something about him right away, and he was wearing clean clothes and a jacket she had not seen before, and his hat was a better one than the everyday battered thing he wore to work. He stood at her door and looked at her and said, "You look lovely," and she braced for the patronizing quality that she had always imagined those words would carry coming from a man who did not entirely mean them. But there was no patronizing quality. He said it the same way he said everything, directly and without embellishment, like a man stating a simple fact. She did not know what to do with that, so she said, "Thank you," and got her wrap, and they walked to the Grange Hall together in the warm May evening with the smell of the plains on the air and the first stars beginning to appear above Caldwell. The Grange Hall was full and bright. Lanterns hung from the rafters, and the Caldwell fiddle band was already playing when they arrived. It was the kind of gathering that was both formal and not. Women in their best dresses and men cleaned up from the week's work, with the older couples sitting along the walls and the younger ones crowding the dance floor and children running underfoot until they were corralled by their mothers. It was the social heartbeat of the town, these monthly dances, and everyone was here and everyone saw everything. She was aware, very sharply aware, of the fact that Monroe Sheridan had come in with her. She saw Caroline Pierce notice them from across the room with her pretty golden head tilted slightly to one side, the look of a girl reassessing a situation. She saw Ada Walsh glance over from where she stood talking with the school board's treasurer. She saw old Mrs. Hennessy lean to whisper something in old Mrs. Purdue's ear, and she could very well imagine what it was. Monroe, beside her, appeared entirely unbothered by all of this. He found her a glass of punch and a place to stand that was slightly removed from the main crush of people, and stood beside her, and talked with the same easy conversational quality that he always had, telling her about a problem they had been having at the Dobbins Ranch with a section of fencing along the creek that kept being undermined by the water level, and asking her what she thought the spring rains would do to the local farming this year. And she found herself talking back without intending to, with the same natural ease, because when he asked her something he made her feel that her answer was the answer he actually wanted to hear. He asked her to dance, and she danced with him. She was not a particularly graceful dancer, but she was not bad either, and he led with confidence and without making her feel clumsy, which required a certain skill she recognized and appreciated. They danced twice before she suggested they sit with her second glass of punch, and he sat beside her on one of the long benches along the wall, and they talked some more. By the end of the evening she was dangerously comfortable with him. That was the word that came to her later, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling. Dangerous, because comfortable was not something she had planned for, and comfortable with Monroe Sheridan felt like standing at the edge of something that went down a long way. He walked her home and stood at her door and said good night with that same directness he used for everything, and asked if he could call on her again, and she said yes before her good sense could formulate an argument against it. He called on her again the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and the one after that. The spring of 1879 in Caldwell was warm and full of work, and Julia's life continued its rhythm of washboards and clotheslines and the daily management of her small household. But Monroe slid into the edges of her days with a naturalness that alarmed her when she stopped to think about it. He would appear at her door on Sunday afternoons with some small thing he had acquired during the week, once a paper bag of the peppermint candies she had mentioned in passing that she liked, once a small bottle of good ink because she had mentioned wanting to write a letter to a cousin in St. Louis, and her old bottle had run dry. He paid attention to small things, which was its own kind of revelation. They walked the edges of town on those Sunday afternoons, out past the last of the buildings, and onto the open plains where the spring grass was greening up, and the sky went on forever in all directions. He talked about Texas, about growing up on a small ranch that his family had eventually lost to debt, about learning the cattle business from the ground up, because it was the only thing he knew how to do, about the years on the trail that were both harder and more freeing than anything he had experienced before or since. She talked about her mother, who had been a practical and tender woman who had taught her everything she knew, about her father who had died when she was 12 from pneumonia, about the way she had been left the house, and the decision to take in laundry as the most dignified available path to independence. "You are the most self-sufficient person I have met in a long while," he told her one afternoon, and she started to deflect it as she usually did, but he continued before she could. "I mean that as one of the finest things I can say about a person, self-sufficient and honest and steady. Those are not small things. They are not particularly romantic things either," she said, because she was always honest. It was practically a physical reflex. "Who told you romance and substance were separate?" He asked, and she had no immediate answer for that, which was an unusual position for her to find herself in. She was falling in love with him. She knew it the way she knew the phases of the moon, by observation and accumulation of evidence. She was falling in love with him, and it was the most terrifying thing that had happened to her in her 23 years of practical living, because she had no idea what to do with it. She did not know how to be someone who was loved in return, because she had never expected to be, and the possibility that Monroe Sheridan might actually mean what he said, and see what he claimed to see felt like something she could not afford to believe in case she was wrong. She told herself she was wrong. She told herself she was reading friendship as something warmer than it was. She told herself that a man like Monroe could be friendly and attentive and still be simply passing time until something better presented itself. She told herself these things, and then he looked at her across a shared Sunday meal at her kitchen table, where she had made cornbread and a pot of beans that he had declared the best he had eaten since Texas. And the look on his face was not the look of a man passing time. It was the look of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be, and it undid her quietly and completely. The trouble arrived in June, as trouble in Caldwell often did, with a cattle drive. It was a big drive, 700 head coming up from Texas, and it brought with it a full crew of trail hands who descended on Caldwell with the collective intent of spending what they had earned. Among the drive was a man named Curtis Vane, who was the trail boss's segundo and who had known Monroe from his years on the Texas cattle operations. Curtis was a big, loud, handsome man with a booming voice and the easy confidence of someone who had always been the most attractive person in whatever room he occupied. Julia first encountered Curtis Vane at the general store, where he was purchasing supplies and being broadly entertained by his own observations, and where he spotted Monroe, who had come to town that Saturday with a couple of the Dobbins hands. The reunion between Monroe and Curtis was genuine and warm, the handshaking and backslapping of men who had ridden hard country together, and Julia stood slightly apart and watched it with the feeling of a woman who was about to be reminded of something she had managed to temporarily forget. Curtis Vane looked at her the way men often did, through her and past her, his eyes registering her presence and then finding other, more interesting things to look at. Then Monroe put his hand briefly at the small of her back, the lightest possible pressure, and said, "Curtis, this is Julia Merritt. She is very important to me." Curtis Vane looked at her again, with different eyes this time, the recalibrating eyes of a man updating his information. "Miss Merritt," he said, with a different quality of attention, "Monroe has been telling me nothing about you, which tells me everything." "He has been telling me very little about you as well," she said, "which I suspect means you have stories that would entertain considerably." Curtis Vane laughed a big laugh and said, "I like her," to Monroe, and Monroe's hand was still at the small of her back, and she was very aware of it the same way she was aware of all things where Monroe was concerned, with a heightened and inconvenient attentiveness. They spent part of that Saturday evening at the Three Rivers Saloon, which was the most respectable of Caldwell's several drinking establishments, in a large corner table with Curtis and two other drive hands and a couple of the Dobbins men. And Curtis told stories about the trail drives and about Monroe that were both hilarious and occasionally mortifying to the subject of them. And Monroe sat beside Julia with his shoulder warm against hers, and the easy possessiveness of a man who was exactly where he intended to be. It was later, when Monroe had stepped outside for a moment with one of the other Dobbins men regarding some piece of ranch business that had apparently been waiting for a more casual setting to be discussed, that Curtis Vane leaned across the table and looked at Julia with frank and not unkind assessment. "He has never talked about a woman the way he talks about you," Curtis said. "In 8 years of knowing Monroe Sheridan, I have not heard him talk about any woman the way he talks about you." She was quiet for a moment. "How does he talk about me?" "Like you matter," Curtis said simply. "Like you are the most important thing in his life, and he has not quite figured out how to say that yet, but it comes out in every other sentence when he thinks he is just talking about his day." He picked up his glass. "Monroe is not a complicated man. He is one of the most straightforward men I know. When he wants something, he goes after it, and he does not want things lightly." He paused. "I am not sure why I am telling you this." "Neither am I," she said. "I think it's because you look like a woman who is not sure whether to believe what is right in front of her," he said, and he said it with enough gentleness that she found she could not be offended by it. and I would not like to see Monroe Sheridan lose something good because of someone else's doubt. She thought about that for a long time after, in the days that followed when the drive moved on and Curtis Vane went with it, back down the trail and out of her immediate landscape. She thought about it while she worked, her hands moving through the familiar rhythms of the washboard, while her mind worked through something harder and less familiar, which was the possibility that she had spent her whole life being sensible and practical, and had in the process built walls that she had convinced herself were floors. It was mid-June, and she had been coming out to the Dobbins ranch to collect laundry for going on 4 months since Monroe had arrived. And on a Tuesday morning she came out in the early hour as she always did and found Monroe already at the edge of the yard with the crate, not because she had asked him to be, but because he had noticed her pattern and had taken it upon himself to make her work a little lighter. He saw her coming down the road and lifted a hand, and she felt the warmth of it like the sun coming from behind a cloud, that simple, that involuntary. She walked up to him and he said good morning and she said good morning back, and they stood in the early light with the whole plain stretched out behind them and the smell of dew and cattle and fresh grass on the air, and she said, "I have been thinking about what you said, in May, when you asked me to the dance. Let me decide that," he said immediately, without needing her to specify which part she meant. "Yes," she said, "I have been thinking about it. Have you reached a conclusion?" She looked at him in the morning light, this man who had decided to carry her laundry crates and bring her peppermint candy, and look at her with that expression that she was increasingly unable to interpret as anything other than exactly what it appeared to be. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have been letting my own opinion of myself decide things that should perhaps be left to someone else." He was very still. "Is that right?" "I am working on it," she said. "I am not entirely comfortable with the process." "I noticed," he said, with that warmth in his voice that was not quite amusement but was close to it. "I have been patient." "You have been extremely patient," she agreed. "I intend to continue being patient," he said, "however long it takes." "It may take some time," she told him honestly. "Julia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the miss before it, and it landed on her like a hand pressed flat and warm over the center of her chest. "I have been working cattle since I was 17 years old. I know what patience looks like. I am not going anywhere." She believed him. That was the remarkable thing. Standing there in the morning light at the edge of the Dobbins yard with the grass bending in the early breeze, she believed him completely, and it was like setting down something she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was in her arms. The summer came down on Caldwell in its full force, the heat pressing over the plains in shimmering waves, the cattle drives continuing their irregular procession up the Kishom Trail, the town busy and loud and alive with commerce and argument, and the general business of a place that was growing faster than it could organize itself. It was still rough country in 1879. The law in Caldwell improved significantly from what it had been in the earlier trail years, but not yet what it would eventually become. And there were disputes and occasional violence, and the constant negotiation between the ranching interests and the farming interests, and the town interests that characterized all of the Kansas cattle towns in this period. Julia's days were full and warm and good in a way they had not been in years. Monroe came to her door on Sundays with the regularity of something that had always been there, and she no longer told herself stories about how temporary it was or what he really meant by it. She had made the decision, in the quiet and practical way she made all decisions, to allow herself to believe what was evident. It was one of the harder decisions she had made, harder in its way than the practical ones, because practical decisions only required work, and this one required something she had less practice with, which was trust. He took her to the July 4th celebration, which was the largest public gathering that Caldwell managed, with a parade of sorts down the main street, and a brass band imported from Wichita and fireworks in the evening set off from the edge of the Dry Creek bed south of town. They watched the fireworks standing side by side in the warm summer dark, and at some point during the second volley of color across the sky, his hand found hers and held it, and she let it, and stood with her hand in his and the sky bursting overhead, and thought that this was what it felt like to be, without qualification, happy. It was not without its difficulties. Nothing genuine ever was. There was a woman in town, Dorothy Ames, who had grown up in Caldwell alongside Julia, and who had the particular familiarity with her that a lifelong acquaintance sometimes produced, not exactly friendship but not exactly enmity, a complex awareness of each other's full history. Dorothy was a good-looking woman of 25 who had married and been widowed within 2 years, and who was now conducting the business of her own future with considerable energy. She had set her interest on Monroe Sheridan with the directness that characterized her general approach to life, and she did not let Julia's prior claim, if it could be called that, particularly slow her down. Julia came into the general store on a Thursday in late July and found Dorothy there, and Monroe there also, he having come in for coffee and tobacco, and Dorothy was talking to him with the full force of her considerable social confidence, her hand resting lightly on his forearm and her best smile deployed. Monroe was being polite in the way that a genuinely polite man could not avoid being, but his eyes found Julia the moment she came through the door with an immediacy that was both flattering and clarifying. "Julia," he said, moving his arm naturally away from Dorothy's hand to turn toward her, "I was hoping you would come in. I need your opinion on something." Dorothy looked between them with the rapid assessment of a woman updating her arithmetic, and arrived at a sum that was clearly not what she had hoped for, and she gathered herself and said something gracious and departed with good dignity, and Julia was left standing with Monroe in the dry goods aisle, feeling simultaneously guilty about the situation and privately, shamefully glad about the way his eyes had found her. "What did you need my opinion on?" she asked. He looked at the shelf in front of them which contained various household items. "I require your opinion," he said solemnly, "on which of these 2 sizes of coffee tin represents better value." She stared at him. "Monroe Sheridan, you did not actually need my opinion on coffee tins." "I might have needed a reason," he said, with the corners of his mouth doing something she had come to recognize as his version of a smile before the actual smile arrived. She pressed her own lips together against a corresponding smile. "That was not well managed," she told him. "I disagree," he said. "It seemed to work." She bought her lie and her thread, and they walked out together into the July heat, and he walked with her down the street to where their respective directions diverged. And before they parted, he stopped and turned to her with a seriousness that was different from his usual quality. "Dorothy Ames is a perfectly nice woman," he said. "She is," Julia agreed. "She is not who I want to spend my time with," he said. "I want to be clear about that." She looked at him. "You do not need to be clear about that with me." "I think perhaps I do," he said, "because I think you are still occasionally in quiet moments telling yourself stories about what I really mean and whether this is something you should be counting on." He met her eyes. "Count on it." She breathed out something that was not quite a sigh and not quite a word. He tipped his hat and went off toward the livery, and she went home and washed the afternoon's accumulated laundry with a vigor that was perhaps slightly less measured than her usual technique. August brought a problem with it that was more serious than romantic complication. The Dobbins Ranch had been having a dispute with a neighboring operation run by a man named Elias Trout, a hard-edged man who had come to the region later than most, and who had a way of reading property lines that seemed to expand in his favor with some regularity. The dispute had been a slow-burning one for 2 years, mostly legal arguments about fence lines and water rights along the creek that ran between the 2 properties, and it had escalated over the summer as the dry weather made the creek water more precious, and as Trout seemed to feel himself increasingly licensed to push his interpretations. It was Monroe who had noticed, in early August, that a section of Dobbins' fence along the disputed boundary had been taken down, and the line markers shifted. He had reported it to George Dobbins, the rancher, and Dobbins had gone to the sheriff. And the sheriff, a capable man named Ezra Pierce, had gone out to look at the situation, and it had become the kind of knotted legal and practical mess that these range disputes tended to become. What complicated it beyond the ordinary mess was that one of Trout's men, a cowboy called Reeves, came into Caldwell on a Saturday and got into a fight at one of the rougher saloons with two of the Dobbins hands, and the fight spilled out into the street, and Monroe pulled his own men out of it before it could escalate beyond fists. But the whole business left a bad taste and a general awareness that the situation was tightening. Julia knew about all of this because Monroe told her about it, which was itself something she had not quite gotten accustomed to. He told her things. He talked to her about his work and his problems and his thinking. The way a man talked to a person he considered his partner in understanding things. And she gave him her actual opinions back because he wanted them, and not a softened version designed to not give offense. She told him she thought the water rights question was the essential one, and that Dobbins needed a proper lawyer rather than simply the local sheriff, because the legal dimension was more likely to settle the thing permanently than any amount of fence-fixing would. He looked at her with that attentive look and said, "You are right," and then he went and told George Dobbins the same thing, and Dobbins sent for a lawyer from Wichita. And while the legal process ground along at its own pace, the situation did not escalate further into violence, which Julia counted as a reasonable outcome. She found it interesting that she had an opinion on range water rights disputes. But living in cattle country for 23 years deposited a certain amount of information about these things whether one was specifically interested in them or not. And she had always paid attention to the world around her because it was the sensible thing to do. On a Sunday evening in late August, Monroe came to her door not at the usual afternoon hour but later, as the sun was going down, and he had a look on his face she had not seen before. Not troubled exactly, more like a man who has made a decision and is now committed to its execution. "May I come in?" he asked. She stepped back and let him in. He came into her small front room with his hat in his hands and stood in the middle of it and looked around at the neat and functional space, the shelves of her books and the dry goods stacked against one wall and the handmade rug in front of the fireplace that had been her mother's, and then he looked at her. "I have been thinking," he said. "I know what you are going to say," she said, because she did. She was a perceptive person, and she had been watching him for going on 5 months, and she knew the shape of this moment even before it arrived. "Do you?" he said. "I believe so." He turned his hat in his hands once and set it on the small table by the door. Then he said, "Julia Merritt, I would like very much for you to marry me. I want you to be my wife, and I want to build something permanent with you, here or somewhere else if somewhere else would suit you better, and I want to spend the rest of the time I have in this life with you specifically and no one else. That is what I want." He stopped. "What do you want?" She had not expected the question at the end. She had been ready for the statement, had been preparing her response to the statement, and the question at the end arrived when her defenses were already partly down and slipped through them entirely. What did she want? She wanted exactly this. She had wanted it since May, when he had stood at her door with his hat in his hands and said, "Let me decide that." She had wanted it through the summer of Sundays and the fireworks and the coffee tins in the dry goods store, and all the conversations over all the miles of plains walking that had built something between them that was stronger than she had been able to build with the stones of her caution. "I want the same thing," she said. "I want to marry you." He let out a breath that was long and deep and genuine, the breath of a man who has been holding something carefully and is now permitted to set it down. He crossed the room and took both her hands in his large, work-roughened ones and held them for a moment, looking at her with a directness and warmth that she no longer felt the need to doubt. "You are the most remarkable woman I have encountered in my life," he told her, "and I mean that as an objective and well-considered observation, and not as a compliment to soften you up. "I know the difference," she said, and she did. "I know you do," he said. "That is one of the things about you." He kissed her then, properly, and with the same quality of care and attention he brought to everything, and she stood in her front room with the evening light coming through the window and his hands holding hers, and thought that the self that had dropped a laundry basket on a May afternoon and watched a stranger ride down the main street of Caldwell had been right to be undone. Some things were worth being undone for. They were married in October of 1879, in the small Methodist church on the edge of Caldwell, that was the newest of the town's 3 churches, and the one with the best light through its east-facing windows in the mornings. It was a plain wedding in the way that most weddings in the territory were plain, without excess ceremony. But the church was full because Julia had lived in Caldwell her whole life, and Monroe had made a positive impression in his months with the Dobbins operation, and the ranching community and the town community together amounted to a considerable gathering. She wore her mother's green dress, properly altered now with the help of Esperanza from the Dobbins ranch, who was a fine seamstress and who had taken the project on with a warmth that Julia found moving. The dress had been updated subtly, the collar freshened, and the sleeves made slightly more fashionable, and Esperanza had embroidered small flowers along the cuffs with white thread that caught the light and made the whole thing quietly beautiful. Julia stood at the church door before the ceremony began and looked at herself in the small mirror she had brought and thought that she did not look like the brides in illustrated magazines, not precisely, but she looked like herself, and she was wearing something made with love and care, and that was more than enough. Monroe, standing at the front of the church in his best clothes with his hair properly combed, and a look on his face that was both serious and transparently happy, looked at her when she came down the aisle with a look that made her absolutely certain she had made the right decision and was still making it. They said their vows in the plain and honest language of the Methodist ceremony, and she meant every word of hers, and saw that he meant every word of his. And when it was done, the gathered Caldwell community expressed its approval with the gusto of people who had been watching the courtship develop over a summer, and were gratified to see it arrive at this particular destination. George Dobbins, who was a generous man at heart beneath his rancher's pragmatism, gave Monroe 3 days off the ranch work for a wedding trip, and they spent those 3 days in a boarding house in Wichita, which was not far by train and which was sufficiently removed from Caldwell to feel like another world. Wichita in 1879 was a proper city by Western standards, with brick buildings and a hotel with a dining room and shops that sold things that had not yet made it to the smaller cattle towns. They walked the streets of Wichita and ate in the hotel dining room and talked and laughed and were entirely and without apology happy. She had never been to Wichita before, despite it being only a moderate distance from Caldwell, because traveling required either a horse or money for the train, and she had never had either one readily available. Monroe showed her the city with the comfortable knowledge of a man who had passed through it multiple times, and she looked at everything with the attentiveness she brought to all new things, and in the evenings they talked about the future in the specific way that people who are building something together talk about it, with plans and intentions and the practical detail of people who take the life they are constructing seriously. He wanted to be more than a hired hand. He had savings from years on the trail and the Dobbins wages, and he had been thinking about land. There was land available north of Caldwell, good grassland that had not yet been claimed, and the beef market was strong and the railroad was making it more so. He had a plan that was careful and modest and achievable, and she listened to it and said, "What do you need to start?" And they talked through the finances the way partners talk through finances, with both of their intelligences applied to the same problem. And by the time they returned to Caldwell from their 3 days in Wichita, they had the outline of something real. They came back to Julia's house, which became their house, and she reorganized it with his presence in mind. It was small but sufficient for 2 people, and they were both people who had lived within means for long enough that they did not require excess space to feel comfortable. She continued taking in laundry because the income was useful, and because she liked having her own work, and he continued at the Dobbins Ranch through the remainder of the season while they put money away toward the land purchase. The winter of 1879 going into 1880 was cold and long, as Kansas winters were, but the house was warm and they were together in it, which changed the character of winter considerably. They built the habits of a shared life. She rose early because she always had, and he rose early because ranch work demanded it, and in the pre-dawn kitchen they had coffee together and talked in the low and easy tones of people who had nowhere particular to be for the next few minutes, and it became the part of the day that she looked forward to most, those quiet early conversations over coffee before the world properly started. She found out in February that she was carrying a child. She told Monroe on a Sunday morning over breakfast, directly in the way she did everything, and he put down his fork and looked at her for a long moment and then got up from his chair and came around the table and kissed the top of her head with a tenderness that was almost painful in its gentleness. "Are you well?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "I feel fine," she said honestly. "I am not prone to sickness. I expect it will proceed normally." She paused. "Are you pleased?" "Julia," he said, "I am so pleased I cannot find all the words for it." She reached up and took his hand where it rested on her shoulder. "Good," she said. "Then we are agreed." The spring of 1880 brought the land purchase. Monroe had been corresponding with a land agent through the winter, and in April they signed papers on a parcel of 160 acres north of town, good grass with a creek running through the lower portion, and a small rise in the center that would suit a house. They used nearly all of their savings for the down payment, which left them with very little cushion, and Julia looked at the numbers they had written out and felt the particular mix of excitement and tightening fear that attended any genuine risk. "We will be all right," Monroe said, looking at the same numbers. "I know," she said. "I just wanted to look at it clearly." "That is one of the things I rely on," he told her. "Your habit of looking at things clearly." They began building. Monroe negotiated the labor, trading his own work on 2 neighboring ranches' projects in exchange for help with the house frame, which was how most building was done in the territory, and Julia managed the practical details of the construction with the same efficiency she brought to running a household, which turned out to be substantially the same skill set applied to a larger project. By early summer the house was framed and roofed, and by August it had walls and a proper floor and a wood stove that was the best thing Monroe had purchased in the whole enterprise, a good quality stove that would heat the house through Kansas winters and cook on through the rest. Their son was born in October of 1880, on a rainy afternoon while Monroe paced outside the bedroom door, and Julia did the hardest work she had ever done with the assistance of the town's physician, Dr. Pemberton, who was competent and calm, and talked her through the process with the matter-of-fact reassurance of a man who had attended many births and knew that most of them arrived at good conclusions. This one arrived at a very good conclusion. A boy, strong and loud, with Monroe's dark hair already visible on his head and Julia's gray eyes just beginning to show their color. Monroe came in when Dr. Pemberton called him and stood over the 2 of them with an expression that Julia had no existing vocabulary for, something past wonder and past joy, something that had no name in any language she knew because it was too specific to this moment, and this small person in her arms. "What shall we call him?" she asked. Monroe sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby with those dark eyes of his and said, "Thomas," which had been his father's name. "Thomas Sheridan," she said, holding the name up to the air to hear how it sounded. "Thomas Monroe Sheridan," he said, "if you are agreeable." "Thomas Monroe Sheridan," she repeated, and the name settled into the room like it had always been there, like it had been waiting for a person to fit it. The Dobbins Range dispute with Elia's trout was finally resolved in the winter of 1880 by the lawyer from Wichita who had done his work methodically and well. The property lines were established legally and properly, and Trout, faced with a legal document backed by survey records and county government, abandoned his expansionist approach to the matter. Monroe had by then left the Dobbins employ to work his own land, and George Dobbins saw him off with genuine warmth and a bottle of good Kentucky whiskey, and the standing offer of emergency assistance if the first cattle season went badly, which was the kind of generosity that Monroe had reason to remember. The first cattle season did not go badly. It went carefully and modestly, Monroe having purchased a small starter herd of 30 head and worked them through the year with the help of one hired hand, a young man named Samuel Webb, who was 17 and from Oklahoma Territory, and who was grateful for the work and the education, and turned out to be as reliable as any man Monroe had worked with. By the end of 1880, the herd had grown to 42 head, and the land was improving under management, the fences sound, and the water maintained. Julia kept the household running with the same steady competence she had always brought to it, adapting to the ranch life with the practicality that had always characterized her approach to new situations. She gave up the laundry business formally, though she took in occasional pieces for neighbors out of habit, and because it kept her hands busy during Thomas's naps, and she applied her organizational intelligence to the ranch accounts, which Monroe had been keeping in a ledger with the approximate precision of a man who was better at cattle than at numbers and knew it. "You should be keeping these," he told her one evening, looking at the ledger she had reorganized and balanced. "I am keeping them," she said. "Good," he said with evident relief. "Do not stop." They found their rhythm in that first year on the land, the rhythm of two people who are genuinely suited to building something together. It was not a life without difficulty or friction. They were both people of strong opinions who had been managing their own affairs alone for long enough that the accommodation of another person's preferences required real adjustment, and they had arguments that were sharp and real and honest, conducted without cruelty, because both of them had enough respect for the other, and for themselves to keep things honest without making them damaging. After the arguments, they came back to each other with the same straightforwardness they brought to everything else, Monroe saying his piece, and Julia saying hers, and both of them capable of hearing what the other had said and thinking about it, and adjusting accordingly. It was one of the things she had not expected about being married to this man, how much his opinion of her she had internalized, and how different her inner life was now from the one that had carried that constant, quiet weight of self-doubt through all her years before him. She still had moments of it. She would be honest about that. There were days when she caught her reflection in the window glass or the small mirror above the washstand and felt the old familiar assessment running through her like a cold current, the inventory of everything that was not quite right, the nose and the straight hair and the rough hands. But then Thomas would call from his cradle or Monroe would come in from outside and say something that made her laugh, and the cold current would recede, and she would move on with the day. It got easier. With time and the steady accumulated evidence of being loved well, it got easier to believe it. She was not certain it ever got entirely gone, that particular habit of self-assessment. But it moved from being a dominant voice to a smaller, quieter one, and smaller and quieter was manageable. In the spring of 1882, they discovered that Thomas was going to have a sibling. Julia told Monroe across the breakfast table again, and this time he was across the table and kissing her before she had fully finished the sentence, which made her laugh and tell him to sit back down and finish his coffee. "I am perfectly happy to finish my coffee on this side of the table," he told her, sitting beside her instead of across from it, which was not a hardship. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1882, and they named her Clara after Julia's mother, which made Julia cry in a quiet and private way when Monroe suggested the name, turning her face toward the wall because she did not particularly like crying in front of people, even people she was married to. Monroe let her have the private moment and then said, "Clara it is then," in his steady voice, and she turned back around with her composure recovered and said, "Yes, Clara Louise Sheridan," and that was that. The ranch grew. 1882 was a good year for cattle, the market prices holding strong, and Monroe had increased the herd to over 100 head by careful buying and good management, with Samuel Webb now a full-time employee and a second man hired on through the busy season. The house had been expanded in the summer of 1881, a proper bedroom added off the back, and a covered porch built across the front that gave Julia a place to sit in the evenings when the heat was too much inside, and the air coming off the plains was clean and good. Caldwell itself was changing. The cattle trade was still the primary economic engine, but the town had added a proper bank in 1880 and a school building in 1881, and the question of civilization versus the rougher realities of trail town life was alive and contested one in the community. There were debates at town meetings about ordinances and liquor, and the rights of various parties that were genuinely heated and genuinely important, the democratic machinery of a new place working itself out in real time. Julia attended those town meetings with Monroe, and was one of the few women in the room who did not simply accompany her husband but actively paid attention, and had opinions about the proceedings, which she expressed to Monroe at length on the walk home, and which he reported back into the community discussions with attribution. It was indirect, being a woman in 1882, but she was too practical to be stopped by indirectness, and Monroe was too principled to filter her intelligence through his own. The years moved forward with the particular quality that happy years have, full and varied, and too quickly gone in retrospect. Thomas grew from an infant into a small boy with Monroe's dark eyes, and an independent streak that he had from both of his parents, and which manifested as a fierce determination to do everything himself, which his parents recognized and respected even when it was extremely inconvenient. By the time he was 3, he was trying to follow Monroe out to the cattle and had to be redirected with some creativity, and Monroe said he would make a good rancher, and Julia said he would first have to be taught that the cattle were larger than he was. Clara was different, quieter and more observational, with Julia's gray eyes and a focused attention to things that was both familiar and moving to recognize. She watched everything with the seriousness of a person filing information away for later use, and she had strong feelings about matters that other children did not seem to notice, like whether the table was set correctly and whether the animals outside were properly cared for. Julia's cousin from St. Louis, a woman named Eleanor Whitfield, came to visit in the summer of 1883. Eleanor was a polished woman in the way that city women of that era were polished, wearing fashionable clothes and using fashionable expressions, and carrying with her the implicit suggestion that the life she lived was more sophisticated than the life she was visiting. She was not unkind. She was genuinely fond of Julia and had maintained the correspondence through all the years, and she admired the ranch with what Julia recognized as the genuine admiration of someone encountering something she had not expected to find admirable. What Eleanor could not entirely conceal was her surprise at Monroe. She had perhaps expected, Julia thought with private amusement, a rougher sort, a plain sort, to go with the plain woman she had grown up knowing. What she encountered was Monroe Sheridan, who had the quiet authority of a man entirely comfortable with himself and his life, who talked about his ranch and his cattle and his wife with equal ease and intelligence, and who looked at Julia across the supper table with an expression that Eleanor apparently found it necessary to comment on later when the men were outside and the two women were washing the supper dishes. "He looks at you like you hung the moon," Eleanor said. "He does not go in for excessive gestures," Julia said. "I did not say excessive. I said like you hung the moon." Eleanor was quiet for a moment up to her elbows in the dishwater. "I will be honest with you, Julia. When you wrote me about him, about getting married, I was surprised. I did not say so in my letters because I was trying to be gracious, but I was surprised." Julia felt the familiar old tightening in her chest. "Were you?" "I was surprised that you said yes," Eleanor said. "I was afraid you would talk yourself out of it. You always had a habit of talking yourself out of things." She looked over at Julia with the directness of a woman who has known another woman since childhood. "You talked yourself out of things because you did not think you deserved them. I saw it my whole life, and I could never figure out how to say it. But looking at you tonight, at the both of you, I am glad you did not talk yourself out of this one." Julia was quiet for a moment, her hands working in the water. "I almost did," she said finally. "I know," Eleanor said. "I could tell from the letters." "He would not let me," Julia said, and it came out simpler and truer than she had meant it to. And Eleanor smiled at her over the dishes with the warmth of a woman who was genuinely glad, and they finished the washing without needing to say anything else. By 1884, the Sheridan Ranch was a legitimate operation, the herd at 170 head, and the land managed well, the fences sound, and the water rights properly documented after the object lesson of the Dobbins-Trout dispute that Monroe had watched play out in his first year in the area. They had 2 horses beyond the working cattle horses, one for Julia and one for Thomas, who was old enough to ride now under supervision, and the covered porch across the front of the house had a rocking chair on each side that got used most evenings when the work was done. Julia planted a garden every spring, a large one that fed them through the summer and that she put up in jars for the winter, and she had expanded it over the years to include flowers as well as vegetables, which was a decision she had not made consciously, but which one afternoon she realized had happened, and which she did not regret. There were hollyhocks along the south side of the house and wild roses she had transplanted from the creek bank, and in the summer they bloomed in colors that were extravagant against the brown and gold of the open plains, and that Monroe noticed with the attentiveness he brought to things she cared about. "Your garden looks beautiful," he told her one July evening, the two of them sitting on the porch in the warm dusk, and she looked at the hollyhocks going deep rose and white against the weathered board of the house wall and thought that it was true and felt no need to argue with it. "It is a good garden," she said, which was as close as she had ever come to simply accepting a compliment without qualification. Monroe caught it. He always caught things. He looked at her from his rocking chair with those dark eyes of his, still direct and warm after 5 years of looking at her, still with that quality of attention that had first undone her on a Tuesday morning outside the Dobbins ranch. "It is a very good garden," he said, "tended by a very good woman." She met his eyes. "I am working on accepting that," she told him honestly. "I know," he said. "You are doing well." "I have a good teacher," she said. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the rocking chair, and held it the same way he had held it at the fireworks in their first summer, and they sat in the Kansas dusk with the cattle settling in the distance, and the children asleep inside the house, and the hollyhocks holding their color against the coming dark, and it was as complete as anything Julia Merritt had ever known. There was a drought in the summer of 1885 that pressed everyone in the area hard. The creek that ran through the lower portion of their land went down to a fraction of its usual flow, and the grass browned early, and the cattle needed supplemental feed that cost money they had been putting toward a third section of land. It was the first genuinely difficult season they had faced as ranchers, and Monroe worked through it with a steady and focused practicality that Julia recognized as the same quality she brought to her own difficulties, and which she found, even in the stress of it, deeply reassuring. They got through it. They lost 8 head, which was a real loss, and the land purchase was delayed by 2 years, but the operation survived intact, and the following year the rains came good and the grass came back and the herd rebuilt. Monroe said one evening that the drought had taught him things about the land he would not have learned otherwise, which was the kind of thing he said that reminded Julia of why she had let herself fall in love with him in the first place, that ability to look at hard things and find what was worth taking from them. The third child came in the spring of 1886. Another boy, dark-haired and loud, whom they named James after Monroe's older brother who was still in Texas, and whom Monroe corresponded with and missed in the quiet way of a man who did not talk about missing things, but felt them nonetheless. James was the most energetic of the three children, and the one most likely to be found in a place he had been explicitly told not to go, and he required a vigilance from his parents that Thomas and Clara between them had not made necessary. Monroe's brother Frank actually visited in the summer of 1887, coming up from Texas with his wife, a woman named Prudence who was sensible and funny, and who Julia liked immediately and thoroughly. They stayed for 2 weeks, which was longer than most visits and not long enough, and there was a quality to those 2 weeks that Julia recognized as the feeling of a life full. She looked around her supper table one evening, Monroe and Frank talking about cattle with the comfortable ease of brothers who have not lost touch with each other, Prudence helping Thomas with something at the other end of the table, Clara arranging something with careful precision on her own plate, James having already finished and been excused to run off the energy that accumulated in him like water behind a dam, and she felt the full weight of it. The life that had come from that basket of laundry dropped on a May morning in 1879. She had not expected any of it. She had expected to get through each day cleanly, and with her dignity intact and her accounts balanced, and those had seemed like sufficient goals for a woman who was not particularly remarkable. She had not expected Monroe Sheridan to ride into Caldwell and look at her from the back of his sorrel gelding and later stand at her door with his hat in his hands and tell her that the decision of what he found worthy was his to make and not hers. After Frank and Prudence left, on a warm August evening, Monroe found her on the porch looking out over the darkening land, and he sat beside her in the way he always did, comfortable, and without requiring explanation for whatever she was thinking. "I was thinking about when you came to Caldwell," she said, without preamble because there was never any need for preamble between them by this point. "Were you? I was thinking about what I said to you when you asked me to the dance." "I remember what you said," he told her. "I told you I was not pretty enough for a man like you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You did." "I was wrong," she said. It came out more simply than she had expected it to, without any of the difficulty she might have anticipated. "I was wrong about that, and I know you told me so at the time, but I wanted to say it plainly. I was wrong." Monroe was quiet for another moment, and then he said, "You were not wrong about how you saw yourself. That was honestly what you believed. You were wrong about giving your view of yourself more authority than mine when it came to what I found worth having." "Yes," she said, "that is the distinction. I am glad you came to it," he said. "It took some time. Most worthwhile things do." She looked at him in the dusk. This man she had been sharing her life with for 8 years, who still looked at her the same way he had looked at her across that first dance floor, with that quality of attention and warmth that had never become routine, because he never let it become routine, because he was the kind of man who showed up for the things that mattered every single time. "Let me decide that," she said, repeating his words back to him, and she smiled as she said them, the wide, unguarded smile that had first come out of her on that Tuesday morning when he had made her laugh by describing Petey Greer's extensive complaints about his broken wrist. Monroe smiled back, the full smile that she had learned in the early weeks of knowing him, and that was still one of the better things she knew. "You did eventually," he said. "I did," she agreed. "I am grateful." "So am I," he said. "Every day." The land purchase went through in 1888, the third section north of the original parcel, which brought the Sheridan Ranch to nearly 500 acres and made it one of the more substantial operations in the county by the standards of the time. Monroe hired 2 more men to handle the expanded herd, and Samuel Webb, who had been there from the beginning and had grown from a 17-year-old from Oklahoma Territory into a capable and trusted ranch hand in his 20s, became the foreman of the operation, a promotion he received with the dignity of someone who had been doing the job already, and was glad to have the title catch up to the reality. The cattle business in Kansas was changing by the late 1880s. The long trail drives from Texas becoming less dominant as the Kansas cattle operations developed their own herd stock, and as the railroad network expanded to make the long drives less necessary. Monroe adapted to the changing market with the same steadiness he brought to everything, reading the industry and making adjustments and talking to Julia about all of it because she was the person he thought with. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked him once, in 1889, on a Sunday morning with Thomas, now 9, and Clara, 7, and James, 3 years old, and loud about it in the next room. "Coming to Caldwell, I mean. Making it this instead of going somewhere else." He looked at her over his coffee cup with the direct dark eyes. "No," he said simply and without qualification. "Not even the drought year. The drought year was difficult," he said. "I do not regret it." Difficulty and regret are different things. "I know," she said. "I just wanted to hear you say it. We are not people who regret, you and I," he said. "We are people who look at things clearly and move forward. That is what we do." She thought about that, about the accuracy of it, about how long it had taken her to become someone who could hear herself described that way and simply agree. She had come a long way from the woman who had told a man he should not want her because she was not pretty enough. She had come a long way from the woman who had made herself the judge and jury of her own worth and issued a verdict in advance. "Thomas," Monroe called out toward the noise in the next room, "if whatever you are doing results in something broken, we are going to have a conversation." The noise became immediately more careful. Julia pressed her lips together against a smile. Monroe caught it, and his own expression did the thing it did, the contained and warm thing that was better than most people's full smiles. "He is exactly like you," she told him. "He is exactly like both of us," Monroe said, "which is either very good or very alarming depending on the day." "Today, very good," he said. "Most days are very good." The years continued their generous forward motion. Thomas grew into a young man with his father's solid quality and his mother's directness. And by the time he was 15, he was working the ranch alongside Monroe and Samuel Webb, with real competence, and the kind of seriousness that made Monroe look over at Julia sometimes, with an expression of quiet pride that she recognized and felt in exactly the same place in her own chest. Clara grew into a thoughtful and precise young woman who loved books the way Julia had always loved them, and who was going to be beautiful in a way that was currently just beginning to reveal itself in the angular planes of her 11-year-old face, a fact that Julia noted and felt a complicated tenderness about. And James, loud and energetic James, grew into a gap-toothed and irrepressible 9-year-old, who was everyone's favorite in the schoolhouse because he was funny and generous and entirely unable to hold a grudge. Julia was 35 years old in 1891, and she stood on her porch on a September morning with the early light coming over the edge of the world in bars of gold and rose, the cattle visible in the middle pasture and Monroe riding out to check the north fence line, the tall figure of him on the sorrel horse that was the second-generation sorrel from the horse he had ridden into Caldwell on that May afternoon 12 years ago. He had seen her on the porch and raised a hand, and she raised her hand back, and the gesture was as natural and as full of meaning as it had ever been. She was not beautiful. She had made her peace with that so thoroughly over the years that it no longer carried the weight it once had, because she had discovered, through the particular education of being loved well by a good man over a long time, that beautiful was a much larger word than the narrow sense in which she had first understood it. She was strong and capable and honest, and on days when she chose to see herself clearly instead of severely, not without her own quality of presence. Monroe had seen that quality from the first and had simply waited with his extraordinary patience for her to see it too. She thought about the woman who had told him she was not pretty enough for a man like him. She thought about the man who had said, "Let me decide that." She thought about all the space between those two moments and this one, the years of building and loving and working and raising children, and getting through drought and celebrating good years, all of it made from the single decision to let someone else's considered opinion of her have equal standing with her own. It was, she thought, the most sensible thing she had ever done. There was a fourth child, they discovered in the late fall of 1891, coming in the spring of 1892. Monroe was 41 and she was 35, and they both received the news with the warmth of people who had been at this long enough to know that a new life was always worth celebrating. The children received it with mixed responses. Thomas, who was now 12, received it with the slightly embarrassed acceptance of a boy who understood the implications and would have preferred not to. Clara, at 10, received it with genuine delight and immediately began planning. James received it with the question of whether the new baby would be able to play, and upon being told that it would take some time, went back to his own activities with the pragmatism of a 9-year-old. She was born in April of 1892, small and dark-haired, and already with the Merritt gray eyes visible even in infancy. And they named her Rose, for the wild roses that still grew along the creek bank, and that Julia had transplanted to her garden in those early years of the ranch. Rose Monroe Sheridan, which was a name that took up considerable space in the world, and which suited her from the beginning. Monroe sat beside Julia on the bed in the evening after Dr. Pemberton had gone and the older children had been settled, and Thomas had built up the fire in the kitchen stove against the April chill, and he held Rose with the practiced ease of a man who had done this 3 times before and with the same quality of wonder that had been there from the first time. And Julia watched him hold their daughter with the feeling that she had been trying to find words for throughout her life and had never quite managed. 4, he said. 4, she confirmed. That is a good number, he said. It is an excellent number, she agreed. He looked over at her with the dark eyes, and in the lamp light of the bedroom that had been part of the ranch house since he had built it with his own hands and those of his neighbors a dozen years ago, he looked at her the way he had always looked at her, like she was the thing worth looking at in whatever room they occupied together. "You know what I was thinking about today," he said. "Tell me." "I was thinking about you standing at the edge of the boardwalk in Caldwell with a laundry basket and your hair blowing in the wind," he said. "That is the first thing I saw of you, standing there straight and practical and alive, and I thought, there is a woman worth knowing." She smiled. "You rode past without stopping. I had just arrived," he said reasonably. "A man cannot stop in the middle of the main street on his first day, but you remembered it." "I remembered every time I saw you," he said. She reached out and touched the back of his hand where he held Rose, her fingers resting over his on the warm weight of the sleeping baby. "I dropped my laundry basket," she told him. He looked at her. "Did you? I have never told you that." "I dropped the whole basket of clean laundry when you rode by. I had to pick everything up and take it home and wash it all again." "You never told me that," he said. "It seemed undignified," she said. He laughed, quiet and real, the laugh she had been hearing for 12 years and still found was one of the best sounds she knew. "You dropped your laundry basket," he said. "Every sheet," she confirmed. "In the dust of the main street." "Julia Merritt," he said, using her maiden name the way he occasionally did, as a kind of tender notation of who she had been before she was his wife. "You are a remarkable woman." "I am working on believing that," she said. She looked at Rose, asleep in his arms, and at his hands holding her daughter, and at the lamplight on the bedroom walls of the house they had built together. "Some days I manage it very well." "Most days," he said. "Most days," she agreed. The Sheridan Ranch went into the spring of 1892 the way it went into every spring, with the work of preparation and the smell of the greening grass, and the cattle moving restless in the pastures, and the particular quality of Kansas light that came with the season, enormous and clean and full of the suggestion that everything that happened in it was happening for the first time. Monroe rode out in the mornings and came back in the evenings, and Thomas rode with him now, shoulder to shoulder on the road back to the house. the boy growing toward the man his father already was. Julia watched them come in one evening from the porch, baby Rose on her hip and Clara beside her, pointing out something in the distance that she wanted Julia to look at. The two Sheridan men riding home in the April light, and she felt the wholeness of it in the way she had been learning to feel the wholeness of things, without immediately looking for what was missing from the picture. Nothing was missing from the picture. This was the thing she had spent years learning to simply accept. She had been told, by no authority more reliable than her own habitual self-judgment, that she was not pretty enough for a man like Monroe Sheridan. He had said, with the straightforward authority of a man who knew his own mind, "Let me decide that." And he had decided. He had decided it in every Sunday afternoon and every morning over coffee, and every shared difficulty, and every good year and every child they had brought into the world together. He had decided it in the particular and patient way that Monroe Sheridan decided everything, thoroughly and without reservation, and with the intention of standing by his conclusion. He pulled up at the fence and dismounted, and Thomas took both horses toward the barn, and Monroe walked up to the porch and kissed Julia on the cheek and Rose on the top of her dark head and looked at Clara and said, "What are you showing your mother?" "A hawk," Clara said, pointing. "It has been circling for 10 minutes. Monroe shaded his eyes and looked. "Red-tailed hawk," he said, "looking for mice in the long grass." Clara filed this information away with her usual precision. Monroe put his arm around Julia's shoulders, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him, and they stood on the porch of the house they had built together, looking out over the land they had built together, the hawk circling in the wide Kansas sky, and the cattle settled in the green spring grass, and the whole of their life arranged around them in the ordinary and extraordinary way of lives that are exactly where they are supposed to be. This was what he had decided. This was what he had asked her to let him decide. And she was, with all the fullness of the 35 years she had lived and the 12 years she had loved him, and the 4 children that love had made, entirely and without reservation glad that she had let him. She would not have called herself beautiful that evening on the porch. That was perhaps too large a leap, even now, even after everything. But she would have called herself loved, and she would have said it plainly, without qualification, without the old habit of reducing it, as the plainest and truest and most important thing she knew about herself. She was loved by Monroe Sheridan, who had made that decision on his own behalf and kept it every day of the years since, and she had learned, the slow and necessary way, to stand in that love the way she stood in everything she had earned, with her spine straight and her gray eyes clear, and her rough, capable hands open and willing to hold what was given to her. The hawk turned in a long, slow arc above the spring grass, and Clara said it was beautiful, and Monroe said she was right, and Julia looked up at the wide sky over the Kansas plains, the sky that went on in all directions forever and ever, and agreed with both of them.